All right, welcome back, guys, for another mini lesson. Today, we're going to talk about the classification of organisms and how scientists classify organisms. This is a 7th grade mini lesson, and as always, we are going to start off with our learning objectives. So first, we will analyze how and why organisms are classified. We will also examine how methods of classification have changed over time, and as well as we will describe the modern system of classification. So we will pretty much take a look at what the classification system was like at its creation, and we will look all the way through up until the modern day use of this classification system. So let's get into it. Okay, so what is classification? We have to understand that before we can understand any of the information that's to come. So the scientific definition of classification, it is a way of grouping organisms based on their characteristics. So we are all very familiar with what classifying is. In fact, this is something that was probably introduced to you at a very young age. If you can think back to elementary school, there at some point was a time where your teacher might have given you a handful of candy, whether that's Skittles, M&Ms, Starburst, and that candy you were told to either put it in groups based on a certain characteristic, whether that is color, size, shape. So that is a prime example of classifying. And like I said, that was introduced to us at very, very young ages. So in science, and as we go through this PowerPoint, you guys will, or I hope that you gain a better understanding of why this classification system is used and how it came to be. So why do we classify organisms? There are 3 main reasons why scientists use this system. The first one being that it makes it easier to study organisms. That's pretty straightforward. If there was no system or criteria for scientists to follow, it would be very hard to identify and label what an organism is, especially if it is newly discovered. The second reason being is that researchers can better identify each organism. So kind of like what I was saying just a second ago. And the third reason is that it highlights the similarities and differences that exist between organisms. So if I have 2 organisms that were newly discovered and they have a lot of similarities, but they have a few differences, this classification system is really going to help me get down to the specifics on what this organism is. And again, that is based on the characteristics of that organism. So yeah, these are my 3 main reasons why scientists or researchers will use this modern day classification system. Okay, so we're going to get into the meat of things, how organisms are classified. So we're going to start off, we're going to go down a timeline, starting off from about 2,000 years ago with Aristotle. So Aristotle is a very well-known scientist who he pretty much established this classification system, like I said, way back 2,000 years ago. So what Aristotle did is he divided organisms into 2 main groups, and those 2 main groups are pretty self-explanatory. They were plants and they were animals. He classified plants based on their size. So depending on the size of the plant, that is how it was classified. And for animals, he classified them based on their environment. So their location where they live. Were they land animals? Were they found in the ocean? Were they found in the depths of the ocean? Were they not receiving any sunlight? Were they in harsher climates like in a desert, on land? So yes, this is kind of the foundation of this entire system, was what Aristotle did, or came up with, sorry. So after Aristotle, we had a scientist that went by the name, his last name was Linnaeus. And so this was around like the early 1700s. Linnaeus took Aristotle's work and he kind of added his own modification to it the way he saw fit. So Linnaeus, he divided organisms into groups based on their similarities and differences. So this is a little bit different than Aristotle, because remember, Aristotle divided organisms based on whether they were plants or animals. He was very simple with it. So again, Linnaeus, he divided his organisms based on what they had similar, or what they had in common, and what their differences were. So this classification system was originally made up of 5 different levels, and those 5 different levels made up the entire hierarchy. So those levels were, I have kingdom. Sorry, this was my little bar was in the way of the screen. So I have kingdom, and that's going to be my highest level, the most broad level. And then underneath that would be class, and then order, and then genus, and then species. So that is what he established. And like I said, this is like the early 1700s. So we still have a lot of time left until we get to modern day. So there obviously have been changes made to this system since then. So our next scientist that made modifications to this system is known as Robert Whittaker. And so around like the 1960s is when Robert Whittaker's modifications became more of a thing, or more accepted. And that is because Whittaker, he saw the work that Aristotle did, he saw the work that Linnaeus did, and he believed that modifications still needed to be made. So with that belief, that is where phylum and family came into play. So that 5-tier hierarchy that I just got done sharing with you all, kingdom, class, order, genus, species, phylum and family were added into that. And that was done by Robert Whittaker. So another thing that Whittaker also included into this classification system is on the kingdom level, he believed that there were 5 different components that could be found, or that organisms could be classified under. And so he established those, he created those, came up with them. Those 5 kingdoms would be plants, animal, fungi, protists, and what is known as monorans. Now that last one might not be too familiar with you all, and I will tell you on the next slide why that is, because it no longer exists on our modern day classification system. So, and he did that. So prior to Whittaker coming around, there were only 2 kingdoms, which again was plant and animal. So if it was not for Whittaker, we would not be able to classify organisms under, or as specifically as we are able to now. So without Whittaker, we wouldn't be able to classify fungus, protist, I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but monorans, and so forth. So he really had a big input in the evolution of this system. All right, and on this slide right here, this is us getting closer to the modern day classification system and how scientists today utilize it. So a new system of classification was introduced in the late 1900s by scientist Carl Woese. Now this is after Whittaker. Whittaker introduced his, I believe, like 1940s to 60s. Now this is even later. This is around in the 1990s time era. So Carl Woese introduced what he believed to be his version of the classification system. And on that, we can see that there is now another level added to the overall hierarchy. So instead of it just being kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, Woese went ahead and added in the highest level that we see here on this picture, which is domains. And so domains, kind of similar to kingdom, how kingdom has 5 components to it. Domain, Woese believed that underneath the domain, there were 3 categories that organisms could be grouped into. And those 3 categories were bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So I just want to briefly state what each of those 3 right here are. Bacteria, we know those are our single-celled bacteria that we find in the environment and the world around us. Archaea, and as we go further down this list, it gets a little bit more complex. So bacteria, there are organisms do have to fall in that category, so that's why it's included. Now, archaea these are going to be also single-celled organisms like bacteria. However, the difference between archaea and bacteria is that these single-celled organisms that are grouped underneath archaea, those are found to live in really extreme conditions, whether that might be in the desert or in an area that has little to no oxygen, or little to no sunlight. So in the depths of the ocean, you also, organisms that might live deep in soil. Again, so these are single-celled organisms that have, or that live in locations that are harsh or considered to be extreme. So lastly, we have eukarya, which eukarya, those are going to be my multicellular organisms. Multicellular means that it's not single-celled. Now, there are some exceptions to that. There are some single-celled organisms that fall under the eukarya category. However, majority of them are going to be multicellular. So these are going to, this is going to be the bulk of my organisms that we find here on Earth. So my plants, my animals, whether they're land or water animals, as well as fungi, all fall underneath the eukarya category. So again, these 3 are considered to be my domains, and this is what Carl Woese included or added to the classification system. And these 3 domains are still a part of the classification system that we used in today's society. So this is now us being brought to what, again, is being used in modern day. Along with the change for the domains, Carl Woese also added in a sixth kingdom. So if you can remember or think back to what I said on the last slide, remember prior to Carl Woese, Robert Whittaker had included and came up with 5 different kingdoms. And like I said, those 5 kingdoms were plants, animals, fungi, protists, and monorans. And remember I said monorans I would address in the next slide, and because there's a reason why that is not one kingdom that people are familiar with, and that is because it does not exist on today's classification system. So what happened is Carl Woese took, he's in his process of making modifications, he took monorans, that 5th kingdom that Robert Whittaker came up with, and he split it into 2. And the two kingdoms that he split monorans into was bacteria and archaea. And so that is how I resulted in having 6 different kingdoms. So when we look at this diagram of the classification system, it is very important to understand, and I wish that there was a way that I could write on this. There is. Ooh. Okay, give me 1 second, guys. I just found out that I can write on this, but I guess I can't write on it with a pen. Okay, anyways, I just wanted to add on, oh yes, I can. I just wanted to add on here that there are 3 domains, and bear with me because I'm using my mouse to do this. So there are 3 domains, again, bacteria, archaea, eukarya, and there are now 6, okay, not too bad of a 6. There are 6 different kingdoms, and this is still what scientists and researchers utilized in today's society when it comes to classifying organisms. So that is something that I feel like will be very helpful, because as I was taking a look at some of the quiz results from you all. I noticed that some people were struggling in getting the domains and the kingdoms mixed up. And so that is something that I really wanted to clarify for you guys, so that way in your second or third attempt, you would have a more clear understanding of the differences between the 6 kingdoms and the 3 domains. So yeah, and after this, I just have a couple of checkpoint questions. Oh no, my annotations, let me clear those. Okay, and these are, you know, these are just thought-provoking questions that I feel like by answering them will allow you guys, one, to gain a better understanding, but if you see questions similar to this on the quiz, you will have something to go off of. So I just want to say them out loud, and you can take time on your own, especially if you're watching the recording of this mini lesson. In your science notebook, you can write these questions down and answer them. If you have to go back to Edgenuity and look at the lesson that discusses classification, you can definitely use that. Use your resources to answer these 3 questions. I just want to read them out loud for us today. The first one is, how has the classification system changed over time? So throughout this whole PowerPoint, that's pretty much what we were looking at, is what the classification system started out as and how it has evolved and what it has, or what it is now in modern day times. So that is going to be a very beneficial question for you guys to have and to answer. Now, number 2, how many kingdoms are included in our modern day classification system? Again, remember I pointed out that I noticed quite a few of you were getting either the kingdoms mixed up with the domains or vice versa. And so I wanted you to have it written in your notebook or stated somewhere clearly. That way you can refer back to it, what the kingdoms are. And the third question, as you can see, is to list the 3 domains that are now a part of our modern day classification system. So again, just having these listed down, and sometimes I even find that writing things out tends to help me remember more when it comes to taking a quiz or an exam. So I wanted to include those in our lesson as well. But once you have those checkpoint questions answered, and you have reviewed this mini lesson, or you have reviewed Edgenuity's lesson on classification, and you would like to take another attempt at the quiz, you please feel free to reach out to me so that way we can schedule that for you or get that reopened for you. But yes, that is all that I have for today's mini lesson. So thank you guys for tuning into this. And again, if there is any confusion left after me doing this, please reach out to me and I will gladly go back over whatever it is that I need to. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you in our next mini lesson. Bye, guys.